Hello, Lynn. Thank you for joining me today from your studio. I want to start by asking a bit about you because you've taken what some might say is quite an unusual route to becoming a full-time artist. So, can you tell us more about that and how it shaped the artist that you've become today?
Well, it's been an interesting journey. I mean, I probably always had a drive to be creative, even though it's come out in lots of different ways. I can remember always being interested in making things and doing things and playing with things in that way when I was a kid. And I did some art at school, but I never really got into that track because, like lots of people, there probably wasn't a great deal of encouragement for it. I went into business like lots of people do, and I had a pretty successful career. I worked in sales and marketing, which was great. Then felt like I needed something more. I wanted to make some form of contribution, really, because it felt like that was so much about money and it wasn't really about doing anything that felt like it was adding kind of some form of, I don't know, intrinsic value, I suppose. So I ended up training as a psychotherapist, which then had a career in that for probably about nearly 20 years, actually. But whilst I was working as a therapist, one of the things that not kind of, became really strong for me was a need to do something that balanced how that work. And it was through my own kind of personal work that I realised that I could reconnect with art, and that would be a way to do that. So that's what I did. I started to really, I suppose, in a very kind of amateur, casual way, do some drawing, do some painting. But then I went on a workshop. It would have been, wow, probably about 20 odd years ago now, maybe more. It was a holiday workshop when I was down in the Isles of Scilly with an oil painter. And it just lit a fire under me in a way that nothing up to that point had. And I think I just, after that experience, felt so energized by the idea of being able to create in this way. And I remember coming back and just painting and painting and painting and not wanting to stop, really. And that was the beginning of it. I mean, that really was the beginning of it for me, because I think after then, so much of what I was doing was about wanting to expand my experience as an artist, to explore it more, to, first of all, like lots of artists do, it was all about the materials. What is there out there? Can I use this and can I use that? How do I do this and how do I do that? So I did lots of exploration around that, like watercolour and pastel and acrylic. But over probably a period of about 5 to 8 years, I think, I started to do some small bits of exhibiting, and then found that I was kind of making work that felt really interesting but wasn't really my voice yet, and I was looking for what that was, and then I think the next few years were really about trying to find that was, and that was interesting, actually. That next journey was fascinating, and it took me in all sorts of different directions, actually.
And so, through that route, tell me how then you have landed on particularly abstract art. What is it about abstract art that
Yeah.
you?
The first things I was painting were landscape, and they were getting semi-abstract, and I was interested in making them more abstract. But it was I discovered it was an American artist, actually, Jane Davis, who does a lot of stuff on YouTube, and I spotted some of her videos, and I thought, oh, these are interesting. And I started to play with abstraction. As I started to play with it, it just felt like this is my home. It was almost like a kind of like a bell chiming or some kind of resonance that, no, this is what I want to do. This is where my voice is. And even though occasionally I feel a sort of, oh, landscape, it would be lovely to, occasionally still do that, but it doesn't really ring true. I think as I've painted for longer, what I've realised is the things that inspire me are my relationship with the materials, how they behave, and what they'll do. And this almost like magical alchemy that happens when you allow yourself to let go of kind of really conscious, for me anyway, conscious intention, and sink into an intuitive process and let that guide me. And from that, all sorts of interesting, exciting things emerge that are unexpected. And it's that spontaneity and the unexpectedness and the excitement for me that comes from that, of just not knowing what's around the corner next, but it could be fascinating, revealing of something of me that I've not yet discovered, or about the world, or something about how the materials just in themselves work, that I think just keeps me engaged every day. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, you can really feel that passion for it and that discovery of self, discovery of materials in a different way. And I'm really
Yeah,
interested, I can really hear that how all consuming it is. And you found this lovely space for yourself now where you're able to do that for a living, you're producing works of art for sale, you're taking them into exhibitions. So what's prompted you to take this extra step and decide to also teach and mentor fellow artists?
I do like to teach. I like working with groups. I like working with people in that way. I find it really, I like having meaningful conversations with people about these things, because I get engaged with that and I learn things for myself. And I'm hoping that the other people that I'm working with are also experiencing that too. So I think there's something really fascinating about that. In a way, it's a similar alchemy to the thing that I was describing. It comes out of relationship, a different form of relationship, but it's about the meeting, I think, of two things or three things or several things. And from that experience, in the case of groups and teaching, it's about dialogue. And through that, we can kind of make some really interesting discoveries. So I think that's what led me into it. And with my experience as a therapist and a group leader, having trained therapists to quite a senior level, supervised therapists, I've got a lot of training experience behind me. And it just felt like actually I didn't want to let that go. I wasn't done with it yet. There's still more things, I think, that I can do with those skills and that experience, where I've got things to bring to the party and that people might benefit from that, And I still like doing that work. I love being in a room or online with people and having a really engaged conversation about something. You both come away feeling like you're enriched by that. It's just great. Like, why would you not want to do it, really?
Yeah, it's another strand of just continuing to do something that you love, something that you're
Yeah,
passionate. Yeah.
exactly.
You've mentioned
Exactly.
offer courses online and in person there. But tell me a little bit more about your ethos in teaching and how you've formed those courses, because I know that we've spoken offline a little bit about this idea that you have about sustainable creativity and giving yourself time to learn and time to develop into an artist.
Yeah.
A bit more about how your courses support that.
I've got a kind of a program of activity, really, I think, which I hope allows people to either, dip in because they've got commitments, because a lot of the people that I work with have either got youngish families, actually, so they've still got, childcare commitments, or they're older and they've got elderly relative commitments. It's interesting how much they do tend to fall into those kind of groups. And those people, sometimes they can commit to longer programs, but sometimes they can't. So what I tend to do is run sort of short, intensive bursts of things where they can kind of dip in, pick something up, engage with it for a short period of time, hopefully really find something that's very valuable in it, and then step back a little bit, still keeping a light touching contact with me. But then at the same time, I also run a much longer programme, which is over a year. And the course, in actual fact, is called Direction and Abstraction. I think I recognised that a lot of people come into, as amateur artists, come into this either from school with a kind of a bit of a sketchy background or understanding of some of the key principles in art making, or not having had any of them. And it takes you so far, and you can do lots without needing that kind of formal education, there's no doubt about it. But at some point, you actually do need that. You need to understand the key ideas and principles behind things like, how do you mix colour? How does value work? How does composition work? What are some ideas behind that? If you're an intuitive artist, how do I tap into my intuition and how do I work with that, but still make paintings where I've got some direction behind them and it's not just me just throwing stuff at, a piece of paper or a canvas. So what I wanted to do with directions was give people the opportunity to go those really solid principles as a kind of foundation stone, really, to then be able to work from. But what I do with the shorter stuff is kind of pull bits out of that, really, bits and pieces, so they get kind of small snapshots of things. So that's kind of how the programme tends to work. But I think, the ethos for me is I'm not the kind of teacher who wants to teach you to paint like me at all. I'm not in the least bit interested in that, because I am very much an intuitive painter. I can't teach you about my intuition, but I can teach you about how to find your own intuition. So there's that piece, I think. So if I think about, what's the driver, I suppose, behind how I'm teaching, is helping people to connect with their own voice, to find what that might be. And I think there are lots of courses out there that talk about that. And I think, well, what is it that's different about mine? Because I come with a background in psychology, I do have an understanding of creative processes, I think, and how they work. I think I also have a pretty solid understanding of personality in people, actually, and what makes people tick, and what gets in the way from people being able to connect with themselves. Because often finding our own voice is about speaking out. It's about saying our personal truths and sometimes having the courage to do that. It might feel a little bit frightening even, or at least, at the very least, anxiety provoking, to say, actually, this is the work that I make and this is the work that I love. And sometimes those kinds of experiences, those kind of feelings can stop people doing that. So I do quite a lot of work around mindset as well. So in many respects, there's kind of three elements, I think, to how I tend to approach teaching anything. There is the foundation stones that need to go into the technical information, like what are the skills that people need to know to be able to do this thing that they want to do. But then, how might those skills tap into people's personality, to the thought of things that they might be bringing into this that is going to be a bit problematic or a bit tricky, and what kind of reflective processes and exercises would help them work through that. And I'm just talking about doing some solid coaching really around this, giving people the opportunity to reflect on their experience and to put into place positive action plans to be able to work on their strengths, build on their resources, and to be able to do things differently as a result of that. And then the third element, I think, is having an ongoing practice of doing those two things, practicing the skills and doing the mindset work, and fitting it into your lifestyle, the way in which your art works, to be able to do it on an ongoing basis so that you can keep track with it really and keep doing it.
Yeah, I really hear that. And I really hear this sort of notion of fighting against some of the rhetoric we heard about sort of the artist in solitude as well, that you're sort of going off on your own and you're just in your own little world. It feels like there's a bringing together, not just of your skill set, but of artists in community as well. And so how important is that bit about having that safe space and that ability to have people reflect your work back to you as well?
We collaborate with people, when we link up with people, we gain so much more than being in isolation, I think. So that's one of the reasons why I run quite a few groups. I run quite a few discussion groups, so people can come along, they get a little bit of teaching from me, but they get a really solid hour or so of being with other artists, showing their work and talking about it and sharing it. I think so much comes from that. There's a common experience of we're all in this together. And I think that can be very supportive for people. You get the opportunity to get decent feedback and conversation about what you're doing, which is really helpful. Hearing what other people think is useful, I think. And I set it up so that there are guidelines about how we give feedback. Because sometimes I think people can be very quick to throw in lots of, oh, why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? Or have you thought about this? I don't know that that's always helpful for people. It can be a bit like Christmas dinner when somebody said, oh, do you want this and do you want that and do you want this and do you want... Yeah, and actually, no, I'm full, I've really had enough. What we almost need sometimes, I think, is to somebody to say to us, well, what was it that you were hoping to do with this? Let's look at whether or not you've got there with this. Am I experiencing this in the way that you want me to? Or am I seeing something different? So that kind of feedback, I think, can be more helpful for people. Community, I think, is really helpful, but I also think it's about... And not everybody finds groups comfortable. I know that. Some people are less comfortable in a group setting than others. And it's one of the reasons why I keep my groups quite small. So they're never more than about 10 or 12 people. If I'm doing a bigger course, then there might be up to 20. But a sort of discussion group is really capped at 12, and most of them are about 6 or 7 people. So there gets to be quite an intimate environment where people do get to know each other. They really do get to know each other. And I think that helps tremendously. But if even that is too much, if it feels like that would be overwhelming, then there's always the opportunity to work with me one-to-one, so you can have more one-to-one feedback and it's just me. And for some people that suits them better too. So I try to give options around that. But ultimately, I think what I'm really keen on around this is don't do things on your own. Find the support and the help and the mentor who can help you. Because for me, on what's been the most significant and helpful stuff as I've been developing my own practice as an artist, has been those people that I've been able to go and talk to about stuff. I've been able to say, I'm having this problem, I'm not really understanding this thing, or I'm really struggling with this, and I've been able to talk it through. And I've found that has been incredibly helpful, actually.
Yeah, and it sounds It sounds like you're doing an awful lot, that your work as a therapist, your work as a teacher, your work as an artist, and those lived experiences that you have, you're finding the ways to break down obstacles for people. So we spoke about it earlier that, you've shortened some courses to allow for people who have time commitment issues. You've elongated others to allow people to really lean in to finding who
Yeah.
they are as an artist. I'm interested to know if people are sitting there now and they're like, "Oh, this is interesting," and they're like, "But I'm not quite sure if I'm the right kind of artist for Lin." Like maybe they're not so interested in abstract art, or maybe they're at the very beginning of their journey. So for you, what makes an artist? When can somebody call themselves an artist, and when are your courses in your community the right time for them to step
Yeah.
in?
Yeah. I think, okay, that's that first bit first. When does somebody call themselves an artist? I think if you're making art and you want to make art, then you're an artist. It's as simple as that for me. It's not about exhibiting or selling or anything like that. If you are exploring art, and I think in some respects it's kind of having that feeling inside you that says this is something that's important to me and I want to do something with it. That's it. The second bit was like, when do my courses become accessible for people? Well, I think if you're an absolute beginner and you've not touched anything before, then you can definitely join my free community. Because there's all sorts of things going on there, and there's lots of things that you can learn from. There is actually a little freebie as well called Beginning Abstraction, which might be quite fun for people who write at the beginning. But then I think beyond that, you probably need to have been playing around with materials for probably, I don't know, 6 to 8 months, maybe a year, just to have some sense of how some of the things work. Because I think if you came into some of those courses without that, you might find yourself, there's so much to kind of grasp around the technicalities of how to use paint that you would probably not get the best from it initially. I think you do need some, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and that can be, it sounds like that can be as simple as they've gone out, they've found materials, they're literally playing with it on their own. They might be looking at YouTube videos. It's not necessarily like you have
Yeah,
to come through
absolutely.
another course.
No, you don't have to do any formal courses or anything like that. And learn how acrylic paint works and maybe play around with that for a little bit. Maybe do a little bit of watercolour, might have done that. Lots of the time I think when artists are very new, they will go and play with all sorts of different things and get all sorts of different experiences. And I think just coming with a few months of that, so you're not completely starting from ground zero, just gives you some experience to be able to draw on. And that's really all you need. You don't need much more than that.
And you mentioned earlier your beginners sort of starting to explore abstraction kind of freebie that you offer, but is this, are the groups that you offer just for abstract artists, or can you be interested in multiple things?
No, you can be interested in multiple things, definitely. I've got a couple of artists who are in some of my discussion groups who do both abstract work and representational work, and they bring that along. There's somebody who's exploring textiles that I'm coaching at the moment. That's somebody that I'm working with. Then there's somebody else who's started to play with ceramics. So they're bringing that sort of work in. I'm always interested to see, because I really do believe that going outside of our kind of core medium that we work with is really valuable. We can discover all sorts of exciting things when we start to play with different materials. And sometimes it might take us down the track of bringing those into our practice, but at other times, it provides a different perspective. And whilst it doesn't directly feed in, it influences in ways that we don't yet know. And often I think we can look back and maybe 6 months, a year or something like that and go, oh, hang on, that's where that came from because I was doing that. And often these things just quietly creep in a way that's very interesting, I always think. Actually, really exciting.
Yeah, it sounds like curiosity, that's why that first step for anyone is just getting curious on their own with materials is going to be an approach that's going to help them across the board.
Yeah. I think there would be the 2 or 3 things that I would say to somebody. If you're setting out and you're discovering art, there's 2 or 3 things I would encourage you to be: open, curious, and accepting of yourself and your mistakes. If you can do that, you're onto a winner and you'll be fine. Those 3 things will just really stand you in good stead.
Fabulous. Fabulous. And if somebody is interested in joining your community or one of your courses, where's the best place that they can find the information?
On my website or on my Instagram feed. You can find it on both. Yeah, and those links will probably be below this video.
Fabulous. Thank you, Lin.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.